The bustling fashion district of New York City hummed with energy as the sun peeked over the skyline. Amidst the chaos of honking taxis and chattering pedestrians, a small, unassuming figure made her way down the busy sidewalk. Edith Thompson, her silver hair neatly pinned back, clutched her worn leather satchel close as she navigated the morning rush. At 68 years old, Edith had seen the fashion industry evolve over decades. Her wrinkled hands bore testament to countless hours of meticulous stitching, a lifetime dedicated to bringing designers' visions to life. Yet as she approached the gleaming glass doors of Vivian Blake Designs, a knot formed in her stomach. The elevator dinged, and Edith stepped onto the 20th floor. The office buzzed with activity, phones ringing, fabric swatches flying, and harried assistants scurrying about. At the center of it all stood Vivian Blake herself, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and sharp commands. "You there?" Vivian's voice cut through the noise. "Where's that hemline I asked for yesterday?" Edith fumbled in her bag. "Right here, Ms. Blake. I stayed late to finish it, just as you requested." Vivian snatched the garment, her perfectly manicured nails grazing Edith's hand. She held it up, scrutinizing every stitch. Well, it's passable, I suppose. Though I expected better from someone who's been doing this since, what, the Stone Age?" Laughter rippled through the room. Edith's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. "I assure you, Ms. Blake, my work is of the highest quality." Sure, Vivian waved her off. "Just try to keep up with the rest of us, will you? We can't have you slowing down the whole operation with your vintage methods." As Vivian strutted away, Edith caught her reflection in a nearby mirror. The years had etched lines around her eyes and mouth, but they also held a wealth of experience. She smoothed her simple blouse and took a deep breath. There was work to be done. The day wore on, a flurry of fittings and alterations. Vivian's upcoming show at New York Fashion Week loomed large, and the pressure was palpable. Edith worked tirelessly, her needle flying through fabric with practiced ease. She overheard snippets of conversation. This show could launch Vivian's brand internationally, securing her place among fashion's elite. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the workroom, a commotion erupted near the elevators. Edith peered over her sewing machine to see Vivian engaged in a heated phone call. "What do you mean, delayed?" Vivian's voice rose an octave. "The show is in 2 days. I need those pieces here now." She slammed the phone down, her face a mask of fury. "Listen up, everyone. Our shipment from Milan is stuck in customs. We need to double down and get creative. I want everyone working through the night if necessary. This collection has to be ready for the runway." Shh. A ripple of panic spread through the room. Designers huddled together, sketching furiously. Seamstresses gathered armfuls of fabric, preparing for a long night ahead. Edith quietly gathered her tools, ready to do her part. As she threaded her needle, a memory surfaced, a technique she'd learned years ago, a way to salvage damaged fabric and turn it into something extraordinary. She hesitated, then shook her head. Vivian would never listen to an old woman's ideas. The night stretched on, a symphony of sewing machines and muttered curses. Edith's fingers moved with practiced precision, but her mind wandered. She thought of the countless fashion houses she'd worked for, the designers who had come and gone. Some had valued her expertise, others were like Vivian. Just before dawn, a cry of dismay echoed through the studio. Edith looked up to see Vivian holding a shredded piece of silk, her face pale with shock. "This can't be happening," Vivian whispered. "The centerpiece of the collection, ruined." Edith's heart raced. This was her moment. Gathering her courage, she approached Vivian. "Ms. Blake," she said softly, "I may have a solution." Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "You? What could you possibly do?" Edith held out her hand. "Let me show you." For a moment, the two women stood frozen, the young, frazzled designer and the seasoned seamstress. Then, slowly, Vivian placed the torn silk in Edith's outstretched palm. "This better be good," Vivian growled. Edith smiled, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Oh, it will be. Trust me." As she turned to her workstation, Edith's mind raced with possibilities. She knew this was more than just saving a garment. It was about proving her worth, showing that experience could triumph over ageism. With steady hands and a lifetime of skill, she began to work her magic. The studio fell silent, all eyes on the old woman hunched over her sewing machine. Vivian paced nearby, alternating between biting her nails and checking her watch. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Edith straightened up. "It's ready," she announced. Vivian approached cautiously, her expression a mix of hope and skepticism. Edith held up the transformed garment, and a collective gasp filled the room. Where once there had been a torn, lifeless piece of silk, now stood a masterpiece. Edith had incorporated vintage lace and intricate beadwork, seamlessly blending old-world craftsmanship with Vivian's modern design. The result was breathtaking. Vivian's hands trembled as she reached for the dress. This is extraordinary," someone whispered. For the first time since Edith had known her, Vivian Blake was speechless. She looked at Edith, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "How did you—" Vivian began. Edith smiled softly. "Years of practice, dear, and a little bit of magic." The tension in the room dissolved, replaced by a buzz of excitement. Designers crowded around, marveling at Edith's handiwork. Vivian, still clutching the dress, turned to her team. "Well," she demanded, "what are you waiting for? We have a collection to finish." As the studio erupted into renewed activity, Vivian pulled Edith aside. I may have misjudged you," she admitted grudgingly. Edith patted her arm. "We all have something to learn from each other, Ms. Blake. Now, shall we make some fashion history?" With a newfound respect between them, Edith and Vivian turned back to the task at hand. The show was approaching rapidly, but now there was a glimmer of hope. As they worked side by side, Vivian leaned in and whispered, "Edith, I have to ask, where did you learn to do that?" Edith's eyes twinkled with a hint of mystery. "Oh, my dear, that's quite a story. Let's just say I've picked up a few tricks over the years." Vivian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I think I'd like to hear more about those tricks of yours." Vivian's curiosity was piqued, but before Edith could respond, they were interrupted by the frantic call of an assistant. "Ms. Blake, the models are here for the final fitting." Vivian's attention snapped back to the task at hand. "We'll continue this conversation later, Edith. For now, let's make sure these clothes fit like a dream." As the models filed in, a whirlwind of activity engulfed the studio. Edith found herself at the center of it all, making last-minute adjustments with lightning speed and precision. Her hands moved with a sureness that belied her age, nipping in a waist here, letting out a seam there. One model, a willowy blonde named Sophie, gasped as she slipped into the dress Edith had salvaged. "This is amazing," she breathed, twirling in front of the mirror. "I've never worn anything like it." Vivian nodded, a rare smile gracing her features. "It's special, all right. Edith here worked some real magic on it." As the day wore on, word spread through the studio about Edith's miraculous save. Designers who had previously ignored her now sought her advice, and even the youngest interns watched in awe as she worked. Vivian, for her part, seemed to be seeing her veteran seamstress in a new light. By late afternoon, the collection was ready. Garment bags were zipped up, accessories were carefully packed, and an air of nervous excitement filled the studio. Tomorrow was the big day. Vivian Blake's debut at New York Fashion Week. As the team prepared to leave for the night, Vivian approached Edith. "I'd like you backstage tomorrow," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We might need your expertise." Edith nodded, hiding her surprise. "Of course, Ms. Blake, I'd be honored." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect September day in New York City. Edith arrived at the venue early, her trusted sewing kit in hand. The backstage area was a maze of clothing racks, makeup stations, and harried assistants. In the midst of it all stood Vivian, barking orders and making last-minute adjustments. As the hours ticked by and showtime approached, the tension backstage reached a fever pitch. Models were hustled into hair and makeup, stylists fussed over every detail, and Vivian paced nervously, checking and rechecking every garment. Suddenly, a cry of dismay rang out. Sophie, the model set to wear Edith's salvage dress, had snagged the delicate fabric on a nearby rack. A large tear now marred the skirt, mere minutes before she was due on the runway. "No, no, no!" Vivian cried, rushing over. "This can't be happening, not now! Hat!" All eyes turned to Edith. Without a word, she calmly threaded a needle and got to work. The backstage area fell silent, save for the distant murmur of the gathering audience. Edith's fingers flew, weaving an intricate pattern of stitches that not only repaired the tear, but enhanced the design. With just moments to spare, Edith stepped back. "There," she said softly. "Good as new." Sophie slipped the dress on, and a collective gasp rose from the onlookers. The repair was invisible, and somehow the dress looked even more beautiful than before. Vivian stared at Edith, a mix of gratitude and awe in her eyes. "How do you do it?" she whispered. Edith simply smiled. "Years of practice, dear. Now I believe you have a show to run." As the lights dimmed and the music swelled, Vivian's collection took the runway by storm. Each piece was met with murmurs of appreciation from the audience, but when Sophie emerged in Edith's dress, the room fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Watching from the wings, Edith felt a surge of pride. This was why she had dedicated her life to fashion, for moments like these, when fabric and thread could create something truly magical. As the final model left the stage, Vivian grabbed Edith's hand and pulled her into the spotlight for the designer's bow. The audience's applause grew even louder, and Edith felt tears prick her eyes. After decades in the shadows, she was finally being recognized. In the chaos that followed the show, Edith found herself surrounded by admirers. Fashion critics praised the collection's unique blend of modern and vintage elements, unknowingly echoing the collaboration between Vivian and Edith. As the crowd began to disperse, Vivian pulled Edith aside. "We need to talk," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "There's something different about you, Edith. Your work, it's not just skill. It's like you have some sort of fashion sixth sense." Edith chuckled. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Before Edith could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. An older woman had entered the venue, causing a stir among the lingering fashion elite. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that—" "It can't be." Elizabeth Hartley. "But she disappeared years ago." Edith's face paled. She gripped Vivian's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave, now." Vivian looked bewildered. "Leave? But why? Who is Elizabeth Hartley?" As they slipped out a side door, Edith's mind raced. Her carefully constructed world was unraveling, and she knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Once they were alone in the quiet of the alley behind the venue, Vivian turned to Edith, her eyes demanding answers. "Okay, what's going on? Who was that woman, and why did we need to leave it?" Edith took a deep breath, realizing the time for secrets had passed. "Vivian, there's something I need to tell you, something I've kept hidden for a very long time." Vivian crossed her arms, her expression a mix of confusion and impatience. "I'm listening." "That woman in there, Elizabeth Hartley, she's not just any designer. She's a legend in the fashion world, known for her innovative techniques and timeless designs. She disappeared from the public eye decades ago, and no one knew what became of her." "Okay," Vivian said slowly, "but what does this have to do with you?" Edith took a deep breath. "Elizabeth Hartley didn't disappear. She's been here all along. Vivian, I am Elizabeth Hartley." Vivian stared at Edith, her mouth agape. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the muffled chatter from the venue. You're Elizabeth Hartley?" Vivian finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how? Why?" Edith, or rather Elizabeth, sighed deeply. "It's a long story, my dear. Perhaps we should find a quieter place to talk." Still visibly shaken, Vivian nodded. They made their way to a small, dimly lit cafe a few blocks from the venue. As they settled into a secluded booth, Vivian's mind raced with questions. "I don't understand," she began, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of coffee. "You're a legend in the fashion world. Why would you give all that up to work as a seamstress?" Elizabeth smiled sadly. Fame isn't all it's cracked up to be, Vivian. I had reached the pinnacle of my career. My designs were worn by celebrities and royalty. My shows were the talk of every fashion week. But I was miserable. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. I had lost touch with why I fell in love with fashion in the first place. The artistry, the craftsmanship. It all got buried under the pressure of maintaining my brand, of always being on. One day I just couldn't take it anymore, so I disappeared. Vivian leaned forward, entranced. But why become Edith? Why work in the shadows? I needed to reconnect with my passion, Elizabeth explained. I wanted to create without the weight of expectations, to remember the joy of bringing a design to life with my own hands. So I became Edith Thompson, a simple seamstress with a wealth of experience. As Elizabeth's story unfolded, Vivian felt a mix of emotions wash over her: awe, confusion, and a twinge of shame for how she had treated Edith all this time. But surely someone recognized you, Vivian asked. Elizabeth chuckled. You'd be surprised how invisible you become when you're no longer in the spotlight. A few gray hairs, some well-placed wrinkles, and a change in posture. It's amazing how people see what they expect to see. Vivian shook her head in disbelief. All this time, I've had a fashion icon right under my nose, and I treated you like an outdated seamstress? Elizabeth finished with a wry smile. Don't be too hard on yourself, dear. That was the point, after all. A thought suddenly struck Vivian. Wait, the woman at the venue? The one everyone thought was Elizabeth Hartley? Who was she? Ah, that would be my sister Margaret, Elizabeth explained. She's been helping maintain the mystery of my disappearance all these years. I suppose she thought it was time for Elizabeth Hartley to make a comeback. As the full weight of the revelation sank in, Vivian's mind began to race with possibilities. Do you realize what this means? If the world knew Elizabeth Hartley was back, working with my label? Elizabeth held up a hand, cutting her off. Vivian, I didn't tell you this for publicity or to boost your brand. I told you because I've come to respect you, and I believe you've learned some valuable lessons about judging people based on appearances. Vivian had the grace to look embarrassed. You're right, of course. I've been awful to you. To many people, really. I thought that was what it took to succeed in this industry. It's never too late to change, my dear, Elizabeth said gently. You have real talent, but talent alone isn't enough. You need heart, and you need to respect the artistry in everyone around you, from the newest intern to the most experienced seamstress. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Finally, Vivian spoke up. So what happens now? Are you going to reveal yourself to the world? Elizabeth sighed. I'm not sure. Part of me has enjoyed the anonymity, the freedom to create without pressure. But after tonight, seeing my work appreciated again, I won't lie, it felt good. What if, Vivian began slowly, an idea forming. What if we found a middle ground? You could continue working with my label, but as a featured designer rather than a seamstress. We could introduce you as a protege of Elizabeth Hartley, someone she mentored in secret before her disappearance. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Interesting proposition. And what would you get out of this arrangement? The chance to learn from you, really learn, Vivian said earnestly. And the opportunity to change the culture in my company, to create an environment that values experience and craftsmanship as much as youth and innovation. A slow smile spread across Elizabeth's face. Now that, my dear, sounds like a plan worth considering. As they continued to talk, hashing out the details of their potential partnership, neither of them noticed the young woman at the next table, furiously tapping away on her phone. Sarah Jenkins, a budding fashion blogger, could hardly believe her luck. She had stumbled upon the scoop of the century. The next morning, the fashion world woke up to a frenzy. Sarah's blog post, titled The Return of a Legend, Elizabeth Hartley's Secret Protege, had gone viral overnight. Speculation ran rampant about the identity of this mysterious protege and what it meant for the future of fashion. Vivian's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Fashion magazines, talk shows, and rival designers all wanted a piece of the story. As she struggled to manage the flood of inquiries, she couldn't help but marvel at the power of Elizabeth's legacy. Meanwhile, in her modest apartment, Elizabeth sat quietly, sipping her morning tea and watching the sunrise. Her phone, too, had been buzzing incessantly, but she had turned it off. She knew she would have to face the music eventually, but for now, she allowed herself this moment of peace. As the city began to stir, Elizabeth's thoughts turned to the future. The idea of stepping back into the limelight, even in this roundabout way, both thrilled and terrified her. But there was also a sense of excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Vivian standing there, looking frazzled but determined. "Have you seen the news?" Vivian asked, striding into the apartment. Elizabeth nodded. "It seems our little chat didn't stay private for long." "What are we going to do?" Vivian demanded. Everyone's clamoring for information about Elizabeth Hartley's protege. They want interviews, photo shoots, the works. Elizabeth calmly poured a second cup of tea and handed it to Vivian. "First, we're going to sit down and have a proper breakfast. Then, we're going to plan our next move carefully. This isn't a sprint, Vivian. It's a marathon." As they settled at Elizabeth's small kitchen table, Vivian couldn't help but smile. "You know, a week ago I would have been running around like a chicken with its head cut off trying to capitalize on this publicity." "And now?" Elizabeth asked, a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Now," Vivian said thoughtfully, "I think I understand what you meant about the pressure of being in the spotlight. We need to approach this in a way that honors the craft, not just chases headlines." Elizabeth nodded approvingly. "You're learning, my dear. Now let's talk about how we're going to introduce the world to Elizabeth Hartley's brilliant young protege, and maybe teach them a thing or two about respecting experience along the way." As they began to plan, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city. In fashion houses and design studios across New York, people were buzzing about the return of Elizabeth Hartley's influence. But in a small, sunlit kitchen, two women, one young, one old, both passionate about their craft, were quietly plotting a revolution in the fashion world. Vivian looked up from their notes, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "You know, there's still one thing I don't understand. How on earth did you manage to keep your identity a secret for so long? Surely someone must have suspected something." Elizabeth chuckled, her eyes twinkling with years of carefully guarded secrets. "Oh, my dear, that's a tale that would make even the most outrageous fashion show seem tame in comparison. Are you sure you're ready to hear it?" Vivian leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "I'm all ears." Elizabeth settled back in her chair, a faraway look in her eyes. "Well, it all started about 15 years ago, at the height of my career as Elizabeth Hartley." She painted a vivid picture of a world Vivian had only dreamed of: exclusive parties in Paris, private fittings with royalty, and the relentless pressure of being at the top of the fashion world. "I was at a gala in Milan," Elizabeth continued. "Everyone who was anyone in fashion was there. I remember standing on the balcony, champagne in hand, watching the glittering crowd below. And suddenly, I felt empty." Vivian listened, enthralled, as Elizabeth described her growing disillusionment with the fashion world she once loved. "I realized I hadn't touched a sewing machine in years. My designs were being brought to life by others, while I spent my days in meetings and photo shoots. I missed the feel of fabric under my fingers, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed seam." Elizabeth's voice grew softer. "That night, I made a decision. I would disappear, but not before setting up a new life for myself." She went on to describe an elaborate plan involving a trusted lawyer, a discreet plastic surgeon, and her sister Margaret's unwavering support. "I spent months planning every detail," Elizabeth explained. "I had a modest amount of my fortune transferred to a new identity, Edith Thompson. I underwent minor cosmetic procedures to alter my appearance just enough. And then, one day, Elizabeth Hartley simply vanished." Vivian shook her head in amazement. "But surely people looked for you. There must have been investigations." Elizabeth nodded. "Oh, there were. But Margaret played her part beautifully. She hinted at mental health issues, at my need for privacy. Eventually, the fashion world moved on, as it always does." "And Edith Thompson?" Vivian asked. Creating Edith was perhaps my greatest design yet, Elizabeth said with a wry smile. I gave her a background, a history. She was a widow from a small town in Ohio, with years of experience in local theater costume departments. It was just enough experience to be believable, but not so much as to draw attention. Vivian was quiet for a moment, processing the incredible story. But why come to work for me? Surely there were less demanding designers you could have worked for. Elizabeth laughed. My dear, I chose your company precisely because of your reputation. I knew working for you would be the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect that the great Elizabeth Hartley would subject herself to the demands of a notoriously difficult up-and-coming designer? Vivian had the grace to look embarrassed. When you put it that way. Don't misunderstand, Elizabeth said gently. I also saw great potential in you. Beneath the harsh exterior, I recognized a true passion for fashion. I hoped that in time, I might be able to guide you towards a more balanced approach to your work. As the morning wore on, Elizabeth continued to share stories from her years in hiding. She spoke of close calls, a former colleague who looked at her a bit too long, a fashion journalist who commented on the familiarity of her stitching technique. There were moments I was sure I'd be discovered, Elizabeth admitted. But people see what they expect to see. No one was looking for Elizabeth Hartley in a crowded workroom hunched over a sewing machine. Vivian shook her head in wonder. It's incredible. You've been hiding in plain sight all this time. But now that the story's out there about your protégé, what's our next move? Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. Well, my dear, I think it's time for Elizabeth Hartley's protégé to make her debut, don't you? Over the next few days, Vivian and Elizabeth worked tirelessly to craft their story. They decided that Elizabeth Hartley's protégé, they chose the name Claire Evans, would be revealed as a talented designer who had been mentored in secret by the legendary Elizabeth Hartley before her disappearance. We'll say that I recognized your potential, Elizabeth explained, and trained you in private, passing on my techniques and vision. Vivian nodded, adding notes to their growing plan. And Claire has finally decided to step into the spotlight after years of working behind the scenes, inspired by the success of the recent show. As they fine-tuned their story, Vivian couldn't help but marvel at Elizabeth's attention to detail. Every potential question was anticipated, every possible angle considered. You know, Vivian said thoughtfully, we're creating a whole new persona here. It's not that different from what you did with Edith Thompson. Elizabeth smiled. You're right. In a way, we're designing a person, just as we would design a collection. Every choice we make adds to the overall picture. The day of the big reveal arrived all too quickly. Vivian had arranged for an exclusive interview with Vogue, where she would introduce Claire Evans to the world. As Elizabeth helped Vivian prepare for the interview, applying subtle makeup and styling her hair, an unexpected wave of emotion washed over her. You know, Elizabeth said softly, part of me will miss being Edith. There was a simplicity to that life, a freedom from expectations. Vivian met Elizabeth's eyes in the mirror. You don't have to go through with this if you don't want to. We could find another way. Elizabeth shook her head, a determined glint in her eye. No, it's time. The fashion world needs a shakeup. And who better to do it than Elizabeth Hartley's secret protégé? As they made their way to the Vogue offices, Vivian felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This interview would change everything for her career, for Elizabeth, for the fashion industry as a whole. The Vogue editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Cynthia, greeted them warmly. Vivian, darling, we're so excited about this exclusive. The fashion world hasn't buzzed like this in years. As they settled into the sleek, modern office, Cynthia's gaze fell on Elizabeth. And this must be the mysterious Claire Evans. I must say, you've been very well hidden until now. Elizabeth, now fully in character as Claire, smiled enigmatically. Elizabeth always stressed the importance of honing one's craft away from the spotlight. I'm honored to finally share what I've learned from her. The interview began, and Vivian watched in awe as Claire, wove their carefully crafted story. She spoke with passion about Elizabeth Hartley's mentorship, about the blend of traditional techniques and modern vision that defined her work. Cynthia was clearly captivated. "Your work on Vivian's recent collection was extraordinary. That blend of vintage and contemporary elements, it's unlike anything we've seen in years." Claire nodded humbly. Elizabeth always said that true innovation comes from understanding and respecting what came before. I've tried to honor that in my work. As the interview progressed, Vivian found herself contributing more than she had planned. She spoke about the impact of working with Claire, how it had changed her perspective on fashion and on valuing experience. "Working with Claire has been a revelation," Vivian said, surprising herself with her honesty. "She's shown me that true creativity doesn't have an expiration date. It's made me reconsider a lot of my previous attitudes." Cynthia raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a change from the Vivian Blake we're used to seeing. It sounds like this collaboration has had a profound effect on you." Vivian nodded, meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "More than you know." As the interview wound down, Cynthia had one last question. "Claire, now that you've stepped into the spotlight, what's next? Will you be launching your own label?" Elizabeth paused, considering her words carefully. "For now, I'm excited to continue my collaboration with Vivian Blake Designs. We're exploring ways to incorporate more traditional craftsmanship into modern fashion and to create opportunities for experienced artisans in the industry." She leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with the passion that had defined her entire career. "I believe we're on the cusp of a new era in fashion, one that honors the past while embracing the future. And I can't wait to be part of it." As they left the Vogue offices, both women felt a sense of exhilaration. Their story was out there now, ready to take on a life of its own. Vivian turned to Elizabeth, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "That was incredible. The way you became Claire, the story you told, it felt real." Elizabeth smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Well, my dear, the best stories always have a grain of truth to them, don't they?" As they stepped out onto the busy New York street, Vivian couldn't help but feel that they were standing on the brink of something extraordinary. The fashion world was about to be turned on its head, and she was right at the center of it all. Elizabeth linked her arm through Vivian's. "Come on, my dear, we have a revolution to plan." As they walked away, blending into the bustling crowd, Vivian couldn't help but ask, "So what's our next move, Claire?" Elizabeth's eyes twinkled with excitement. "Oh, I have a few ideas. But first, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your fall collection. I have some thoughts on incorporating some truly innovative techniques." As Elizabeth began to outline her ideas, Vivian found herself hanging on every word. The passion and creativity that had made Elizabeth Hartley a legend were on full display, and Vivian felt a renewed excitement for her craft that she hadn't experienced in years. They made their way to a small, out-of-the-way cafe, a favorite spot of Elizabeth's where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard. As they settled into a cozy booth, Elizabeth pulled out a small sketchbook from her bag. "Now, my dear," she said, her eyes twinkling with excitement, "let me show you what I have in mind." Elizabeth's pencil flew across the page, bringing to life designs that took Vivian's breath away. Each sketch seamlessly blended classic techniques with cutting-edge concepts, creating pieces that were both timeless and thoroughly modern. "You see," Elizabeth explained, pointing to a particularly intricate design, "by incorporating these vintage smocking techniques into a contemporary silhouette, we create something entirely new. It honors the craftsmanship of the past while pushing the boundaries of modern fashion." Vivian leaned in, captivated. "It's brilliant, but how do we execute something like this on a larger scale? The level of skill required." Elizabeth smiled knowingly. "That, my dear, is where our revolution truly begins. It's time we changed the way the fashion industry views and values experienced craftspeople." Over the next hour, Elizabeth outlined her vision, a fashion house that not only created beautiful clothing, but also served as a training ground for a new generation of artisans. She spoke of apprenticeship programs, collaborations with traditional craftspeople from around the world, and a renewed focus on the art of fashion rather than just the business of it. "We have an opportunity here," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with conviction. to not only create beautiful clothes but to preserve and evolve the very craft of fashion itself. Vivian nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. It's ambitious, and it won't be easy. The industry is set in its ways. Since when has that ever stopped you? Elizabeth challenged with a grin. The Vivian Blake I know has never shied away from a challenge. Vivian laughed, feeling a surge of determination. You're right. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's shake things up. As they continued to plan, the cafe around them bustled with activity. Neither of them noticed the young woman at the next table, her eyes wide with recognition as she snapped a discreet photo with her phone. The next morning, Vivian woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. As she scrolled through her feed, her heart sank. There, splashed across several fashion blogs, was a grainy photo of her and Elizabeth, or rather, Claire, deep in conversation at the cafe. The headlines ranged from intriguing to sensational. Vivian Blake and mystery mentor spotted, fashion's new power duo. Exclusive, Claire Evans caught in secret meeting. What's next for fashion's rising star? Is Vivian Blake's empire about to expand? Sources say big changes are coming. Vivian's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Elizabeth. I suppose you've seen the news, Elizabeth said without preamble. It's everywhere, Vivian confirmed. What do we do now? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Vivian could almost hear the gears turning in Elizabeth's mind. Well, my dear, Elizabeth finally said, a note of excitement in her voice. I believe it's time we gave them something to really talk about. Over the next few weeks, the fashion world was abuzz with speculation. Vivian and Claire were spotted at various industry events, always deep in conversation, always with an air of secrecy surrounding them. Rumors flew about upcoming collaborations, revolutionary designs, and a complete overhaul of Vivian Blake designs. Behind the scenes, Vivian and Elizabeth worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They reached out to master craftspeople from around the world, offering them positions as teachers and mentors in their new atelier. They developed a curriculum that blended traditional techniques with modern technology, creating a truly unique approach to fashion education. As word spread about their plans, they were surprised by the response. Young designers, disillusioned with the fast-paced, disposable nature of modern fashion, clamored to be part of this new movement. Experienced artisans, long overlooked by the industry, saw an opportunity to pass on their knowledge to a new generation. One particularly memorable day, as they were setting up their new workspace, a group of protesters gathered outside. Vivian's heart sank, assuming they were there to criticize their plans. But as she stepped outside to address them, she was shocked to find that they were there in support. We're fashion students, a young woman at the front of the group explained. We're tired of being taught that speed and profit are more important than quality and creativity. What you're doing here, it's what we've been waiting for. Vivian was touched by their passion and invited the group inside. As she watched Elizabeth, still in her guise as Claire, talking with the students, sharing her knowledge and inspiring them with her vision, Vivian felt a surge of pride. They were really doing this. They were changing things. As the weeks turned into months, the anticipation for Vivian Blake Design's next collection reached a fever pitch. Fashion insiders whispered about revolutionary techniques, unprecedented collaborations, and a return to true craftsmanship. The night before their big reveal, Vivian and Elizabeth sat in the quiet of their atelier, surrounded by the fruits of their labor. Exquisite garments hung on racks, each piece a testament to the skill and artistry of their team. Are you ready for tomorrow? Vivian asked, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same passion that had driven her throughout her career. My dear, I've been ready for this moment for 15 years. As they shared a quiet laugh, Vivian marveled at how much had changed. Just months ago, she had been a different person, driven by ego and a narrow vision of success. Now, sitting here with Elizabeth, she felt like she was part of something much bigger than herself. You know, Vivian said thoughtfully, when this all started, I thought I was getting a secret weapon, the protege of Elizabeth Hartley. But what I really got was so much more. I got a mentor, a partner, a friend." Elizabeth reached out and squeezed Vivian's hand. "And you, my dear, have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the joy of creation, the thrill of pushing boundaries. Together, we're not just making fashion, we're making history." As they sat there, surrounded by the tangible results of their vision, both women felt a sense of anticipation for what the future held. They had started a movement, ignited a passion in a new generation of designers and artisans. Tomorrow they would share their creation with the world. But for now, in the quiet of the atelier, they simply enjoyed the moment. Two women from different generations, united by their love for fashion and their desire to leave a lasting impact on the industry they both loved. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, signaling the start of their big day, Vivian turned to Elizabeth with a mischievous grin. "So, Claire," she said, emphasizing the pseudonym, "are you ready to take the fashion world by storm?" Again. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with excitement and a hint of nostalgia. "My dear Vivian," she replied, her voice filled with warmth and anticipation, "I do believe this might be my greatest comeback yet." The day of the reveal dawned bright and clear, a perfect New York autumn day. The venue, a restored industrial space in Brooklyn, buzzed with anticipation. Fashion editors, buyers, and influencers from around the world had gathered, all eager to see what Vivian Blake and the mysterious Claire Evans had created. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Models were being primped and prepped, each garment carefully steamed and adjusted. Vivian moved through the chaos with purpose, checking every detail, her eyes sharp and focused. Elizabeth, still in character as Claire, stood quietly in a corner, watching the flurry of activity with a small smile. This was a familiar scene to her, one she had experienced countless times in her career as Elizabeth Hartley. But today felt different. Today, she wasn't just showcasing her own vision, but a collaborative effort that represented a new direction for the entire industry. As the time for the show approached, Vivian made her way to Elizabeth's side. "Nervous?" she asked, a hint of her own anxiety showing through her confident exterior. Elizabeth chuckled softly. "My dear, after all these years, I've learned that a little nervousness is a good thing. It keeps us sharp." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "But between you and me, I haven't felt this excited about a show in decades." The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. Vivian stepped out onto the runway, her heart pounding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and clear, "thank you for joining us today. What you're about to see is more than just a new collection. It's a new vision for fashion, one that honors the past while embracing the future." She gestured to the side of the stage, where Elizabeth stood. None of this would have been possible without the extraordinary talents of Claire Evans, protege of the legendary Elizabeth Hartley. "Claire, would you like to say a few words?" As Elizabeth stepped into the spotlight, a ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. She smiled, her years of experience evident in her poise. "Fashion has always been about evolution," she said, her voice carrying easily through the space. "Today we're not just evolving style, but the very way we approach design and craftsmanship. Each piece you'll see represents a collaboration between traditional artisans and modern innovators. This is the future of fashion, respectful of its roots, yet boldly moving forward." With that, the show began. As the first model stepped onto the runway, a collective gasp rose from the audience. The garment was a masterpiece, a gown that seemed to float, its fabric a mesmerizing blend of traditional hand-woven silk and cutting-edge sustainable materials. The intricate beadwork, done by a master artisan from India, caught the light in a way that made the dress seem alive. Each subsequent piece told a similar story. A jacket that combined classic tailoring techniques with 3D printed elements, a series of dresses that showcased forgotten embroidery styles reimagined for the modern era, accessories that married ancient metalworking methods with contemporary design. As the show progressed, the energy in the room built. Fashion editors leaned forward in their seats, frantically taking notes. Buyers whispered excitedly to each other, already planning their orders. Even the most jaded industry veterans couldn't hide their awe. The final piece was a showstopper, a wedding gown that seemed to embody everything the collection represented. Its bodice featured intricate lacework done by a 90-year-old artisan from Belgium, while its skirt incorporated innovative fabric technology that allowed it to change color subtly as the model moved. It was a perfect fusion of old and new, craft and innovation. As Vivian and Elizabeth took their final bow, the applause was thunderous. The audience rose to their feet, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Vivian felt tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by the response. She looked at Elizabeth, seeing her own emotion mirrored in the older woman's face. In the chaos that followed the show, Vivian and Elizabeth were mobbed by well-wishers and press. The reviews were instantaneous and glowing. A game changer for the industry. Blake and Evans have redefined what fashion can be. A masterclass in blending tradition with innovation. As they navigated the crowd, accepting congratulations and fielding questions, Vivian couldn't help but notice a commotion near the back of the room. She nudged Elizabeth, nodding towards the disturbance. A woman was pushing her way through the crowd, her face a mix of shock and something else, recognition. As she got closer, Elizabeth's eyes widened. It was her sister, Margaret. "Lizzie?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, but in that moment, it seemed to cut through all the noise in the room. A hush fell over the nearby crowd as people began to realize something significant was happening. Elizabeth stood frozen, her carefully constructed persona threatening to crumble. Vivian, sensing the gravity of the moment, quickly took charge. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll excuse us for a moment, family emergency." She ushered Elizabeth and Margaret into a nearby private room, closing the door firmly behind them. Once alone, Margaret turned to her sister, tears in her eyes. I suspected when I saw the news about Claire Evans, but I couldn't be sure." "Oh, Lizzie, it really is you?" Elizabeth, her own eyes glistening, pulled her sister into a tight embrace. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go on this long. I needed to find myself again." As the sisters reconnected, Vivian stood quietly by the door, giving them their moment. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected turn of events. After a few minutes, Elizabeth turned to Vivian, her face set with determination. "I think it's time, my dear, time for the whole truth to come out." Vivian nodded slowly. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back." Elizabeth smiled, a weight seeming to lift from her shoulders. "I'm sure. I've been hiding for too long. What we've created here, it deserves to have the whole story told." With a deep breath, they stepped back out into the crowded venue. The buzz of conversation died down as Vivian raised her hands for attention. "Everyone, if I could have your attention, please. We have an important announcement to make." She looked at Elizabeth, giving her an encouraging nod. Elizabeth stepped forward, her head held high. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is not Claire Evans. I am Elizabeth Hartley." The room erupted in gasps and exclamations of shock. Cameras flashed and reporters pushed forward, all clamoring for more information. Over the next hour, Elizabeth told her story. Her disillusionment with the fashion world, her decision to disappear, and her years working anonymously as Edith Thompson. She spoke of her collaboration with Vivian, and how it had reignited her passion for fashion and her belief in the industry's potential for change. As the story unfolded, the mood in the room shifted from shock to awe to inspiration. Here was a legend of the fashion world, returning not with a focus on her own glory, but with a vision for transforming the entire industry. In the days and weeks that followed, the fashion world was turned upside down. The story of Elizabeth Hartley's return and the revolutionary approach of her collaboration with Vivian Blake dominated headlines and industry discussions. But more importantly, it sparked a movement. Designers around the world began to rethink their approaches, seeking out collaborations with traditional artisans. Fashion schools revised their curriculums, placing a new emphasis on craftsmanship and sustainability. Even major fashion houses started to change their practices, recognizing the value of slowing down and focusing on quality over quantity. For Vivian and Elizabeth, it was just the beginning. They continued to work together, mentoring young designers, championing ethical and sustainable practices, and pushing the boundaries of what fashion could be. One evening, months after their groundbreaking show, Vivian and Elizabeth sat in their atelier, surrounded by sketches for their next collection. Vivian looked up from her work, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, or rather, when I first met Edith, I never could have imagined where this journey would lead us." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same passion that had driven her throughout her career. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? But I believe this is exactly where we were meant to end up." Vivian nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "We're really doing it, aren't we? We're changing the world of fashion." "One stitch at a time, my dear," Elizabeth replied, picking up her pencil. "Now, what do you think about this design for our next show?" As they bent their heads together over the sketch, their laughter mingling with the soft scratch of pencil on paper, both women felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had found not just a creative partnership, but a friendship that bridged generations. And together, they were writing a new chapter in the history of fashion. One that honored the past, embraced the future, and celebrated the timeless artistry of their craft.